Before I came to office, the story was about how the People's Republic of China was increasing its power and America was failing in the world. Not anymore. Today, we're in the strongest position in decades to compete with China or anyone else in the world. Anyone else in the world. We face serious challenges across the world. But in the past 2 years, democracies have become stronger, not weaker. Autocracies have grown weaker, not stronger. Name me a world leader who changed places with Xi Jinping. Name me one. Name me one. China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They can't even figure out how to deal with the fact that they have this great division between the China Sea and the mountains in the west. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. I mean, they're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not competition for us.
Despite what President Biden may say, China is our most formidable enemy at the moment. They just recently opened a spy base on Cuba. They manufacture and produce the fentanyl, which is funneled across our southern border, which is the #1 cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. They also spy on 120 million Americans through apps like TikTok and Weichert. How much do you know about the threat posed by China? Do you know that this presidential election in 2024 is the turning point, the singular most important event with regard to our relationship with China? Well, today I have Brandon Weichert, an expert on China, the author of the recent book, Biohacked, China's Race to Control Life, to talk about this formidable enemy with us today. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode. And also be sure to follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. Now, those of you who have watched me for a while know that I talk about China at least once a week. It's amazing the dichotomy that we see with regard to the rhetoric about China. There is one political party in the United States which dismisses the threat posed by this adversary, and there is another which affirms just how grave it is. I'm so pleased today to welcome Brandon Weichert to the program. He is a foreign policy expert who manages the Weichert Report, World News Done Right. He has also contributed to publications such as The American Spectator, American Greatness, and he's been a guest on this show before, Timeless, with Julie Hartman. He lives by Herman Cahn's mantra that he is against fashionable thinking. Herman Kahn says, I am against fashionable thinking, but I'm sure Brandon would say, he is against fashionable thinking, hence why I changed that pronoun. Therefore, his life's entire work has been predicated on challenging conventional wisdom and assumptions on a variety of matters, notably in national security. He is a prolific author. He wrote Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy, and most recently, he published a book on China, which I have read. It is excellent. Highly informative. It's called Biohacked, China's Race to Control Life. And just to add to that list of credentials, Mr. Weichert is a senior editor at 1945.com. Brandon, welcome to the program. Welcome back, I should say.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you. It's always fun to do this.
It is so fun to do this. And just so all of you know, I interviewed Brandon recently when I guest hosted for Dennis Prager, his radio show when he was out of town. And it was just after China opened its spy base on Cuba, or at least when the United States announced that China had opened the spy base. And you know what was so interesting, everyone? Right when I said, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Brandon Weichert to the show, all of a sudden, his feed cut out. And you say that this has happened to you on other programs.
Yeah, it's been going on since that. I think that interview was 2 weeks ago. It's happened basically every major network appearance, Bannon show. I had to, as I said during the break, I had to basically, I live near my family, my parents. I had to basically drive over there to use their internet because everything just went dead 8 minutes before, 10 minutes before the interview was set. So I'm constantly crossing my fingers now because every time I have a national interview in which I promote the book, suddenly everything sort of just stops working.
Yes. Well, if you are listening to this interview, you have made it past the CCP's interference, and you are seeing really. I know I'm laughing about it, but I say in all seriousness. I mean, we are engaging in some extremely honest talk about the threat posed by this nation, and I admire you, Brandon, hugely
Thank you. Likewise.
thank you for this contribution, because it takes guts to speak the truth in this country, but it especially takes guts to speak the truth about China. Now, as you know, I am a huge history buff. I'm a history nerd. I always talk about history, and on this show, I recently did a history of China. It's fascinating to think that just 60 years ago, under Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, China was purposefully economically crippling itself in order to perpetuate a permanent socialist revolution in the countryside. 60 years later, China is, as I said in the introduction, our most formidable adversary, not just economically, but politically. So my first question for you is, when do you see it turning? How did that happen? And what over the past few decades has been the biggest contributors to their position now?
Well, I think first we have to go back. I think 60 years ago is a great time to look at. But go back a little bit further to the year 1878. At the time, China was being laid low by European colonists, and they also lumped the United States in with that. The Chinese do. And basically, there was a nationalist movement in China that was trying to inspire the next generation of Chinese to reclaim the mantle of greatness. Remember, this is a 4,000-year-old society. Most of that time, they were a dominant empire. And so we sort of had a very weak point in Chinese history. And there was a man named Zhang Zhidong who wrote an essay called The Exhortation to Study, in which he told the Chinese young people, go to Europe, go to America, go study abroad, learn at the feet of the Europeans and the Americans, the Westerners, because their technology was their secret bullet. It was their secret, ace up their sleeve to use against China to keep us down. Learn that tech, bring it here, plant it like seeds in the ground, and 1,000 knowledge flowers will bloom that we will be able to then use against the West. Well, that essay sat in a library for 50, 60 years after it was published, but it was read by a young librarian who would become the greatest communist revolutionary of Asia, and that man was Mao Zedong. And he kept that idea, that exhortation to study, alive and well in his ideology. And so when he took power in 1949, when he beat Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War, one of the slogans he said in his victory speech was, "We must catch up to Great Britain and overtake the United States." Now, he wasn't talking just about ideologically. He was talking about technologically. And so when he was partnered with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, he was actually engaged in massive industrial espionage to turn his agrarian nation into an industrial power. He stole Soviet technology. That was one of the reasons why Khrushchev ultimately took the Soviet Union out of its alliance with China, because he was sick and tired of Mao constantly stealing all the Soviets' technology. Once that happened, Mao Zedong is left holding the bag. What's he going to do? He still needs tech to keep modernizing his country. So he pivots and sends word to the Americans, who were desperate because we had just lost Vietnam, basically. And he said word to the Americans, the Nixon administration, I'm willing to be a trading partner. And then, of course, what happened thereafter was the last 50 or 60 years now of horrible history in which we've basically given over every bit of technological and economic advantage we once had. We gave it, for the most part, for, if not free, for next to nothing. And now China's the second largest economy in GDP terms. They're not content to just be the sweatshop of the world, which is what Wall Street told itself they were only going to be. They are now building, as the book talks about, a high-tech sector that's not just imitative of the United States, it's innovative. And that innovation will be used not just to beat us economically, Julie, but it will be used to beat us militarily.
I hate to give a compliment to China because they have so undermined and the United States and indeed killed Americans, as I said in the introduction, through among other things, fentanyl. They are obviously awful, commit daily human rights abuses towards their own citizens, and especially the Uyghur population, where they are having concentration camps to exterminate those individuals. I hate to give them a compliment, but we have to hand it to them. 60 years ago, they were in a pretty destitute state, and they have pursued a long-term vision of power, and they have implemented that. You know, the first chapter of your book is entitled Warfare Through Other Means. I thought that was such a good title because, as you eloquently write, China has pursued a different strategy than most other hegemons. Even if you look at the United States, when we wanted control over a country, we invaded Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. China, at least in its recent history, has pursued what I call an eerily brilliant backdoor strategy of going into countries, acting like China is their friend, industrializing those countries, and it essentially what that does, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, Colombia, I mean, even places like Sri Lanka and Israel are buying terminals at ports, the list goes on. They are buying off those countries so as to buy their silence whenever China commits a wrongdoing. So can you talk to us about this warfare through other means?
Yeah, and actually, I want to say that what you talked about is the American proclivity for force. That's a product of the last century. Before the 20th century, the United States actually did what the Chinese are doing to some level. We put trade first. We integrated ourselves in the world system, not through military directly means, but we did it because we were not the strongest power. We used trade as the door opener, as sort of the greeting, and then we sort of enmeshed ourselves in a country's affairs and sort of entangled them. We did the same thing. In fact, China, industrial espionage, we did that to the British Empire with the textile industry in the 19th century. Samuel Slater was a British textile worker, couldn't get ahead in Britain, so he came over to the newly formed United States, where he was told anybody could get rich or die trying, and he's known as the father of the American system because he brought with him the details of Britain's textile industry, and he built the first American factory here. He's known as the father of the American factory system. In England, he's known as Slater the Traitor because it's the first example of U.S. industrial espionage directed against Great Britain. Well, China's doing the same thing to us today with the new industrial revolutionary technologies. And instead of having one Slater the Traitor, we're producing millions of Slater the Traitors, it seems, who want to go over and do business with China at all costs. And so I do think we need to keep in mind that China really has learned at our feet even things that we have sort of forgotten. And what they're very good at is they don't have to use military force to threaten and cajole countries to do what they want. They can buy them off. And it turns out a much better way of doing business because we see when the Americans use force, even if it's for a righteous cause, we're going to end up alienating people because people don't like that we're using force. China doesn't have to use force against foreign powers. They can just throw a lot of money at them and then get what they want. And then it looks like everybody's winning. And then you shift influence and you shift power away from the existing order, the American-led order, and you quietly over many decades shift it toward China. And this is sort of the Chinese all warfare is deception, Sun Tzu mentality, warfare through other means, beating the Americans strategically without engaging them militarily, because why would you want to?
Yes. Sun Tzu is smiling from his grave,
That's right.
It seems. I actually wrote an article, I believe it was published in the American Spectator, and the title was Sun Tzu is smiling. So
Yeah, he is. Right.
yes. So China is buying off many countries. I mentioned Colombia is one of the biggest ones, many in Latin America. You know, when the second Chinese spy balloon traversed over Latin America, these countries didn't say anything critical of China. They dutifully repeated the narrative that it was a weather balloon. Why? Because China's building a railway line in the capital of Colombia, you know, building infrastructure all around Latin America. But if you look at Russia and Iran, I would say that China is laying the seeds to buy them off, but it doesn't appear quite yet that China has succeeded in buying them off. They still remain kind of autonomous in their global hegemony, but the long-term weakness of Russia and the long-term weakness of Iran, I'm sure benefits China. So how do you see, you know, China is getting very close to the Ayatollahs in Iran. Certainly Xi Jinping is close with President Putin, called him a dear friend just a few weeks ago. How do you see the way China's working their relationship with those two countries?
Well, they're taking advantage of really poor U.S. foreign policy that we've had for both the greater Middle East and with Russia. And so if you look at what Russia's doing, Russia's not a natural friend of China. They are a historical rival going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is that, especially under the Democrats, all hope of a amicable and relatively peaceful coexistence with Russia has been destroyed. And so Russia's looking for friends. And so China's their biggest neighbor. So they're becoming friendly with China, and Putin's happily becoming a vassal state of Beijing's new empire. Iran is a similar issue. They need Chinese assistance to basically dominate the region that they're in at a time when the Americans are desperately leaving. They're running for the exits, and they're seeking to hand off the greater Middle East to Iran. And at the same time, they're alienating our friends in Israel. They're alienating our friends in the Sunni Arab world. The Americans are. And so those two groups, whereas Trump was bringing them together in this Abraham Accord that was probably going to be a precursor to some form of a military alliance to contain Iran, now those two groups are again divided, and they're having to make their own deals with Iran and the Chinese and Russian access in order to get a better, more advantageous position in a post-American Middle East, all of which redounds to China's benefit without ever having fired a shot. You know, we spent an insane amount of money on the Middle East over the last 20 years and a lot of blood. And what do we have to show for it? We're losing categorically across the board in every part of that region. We are losing, and the Chinese are the ones who are picking up the pieces. And that's what's going on in places like Africa. It's going on in South Asia. It's going on in Europe. It's going on in our own backyard in Latin America. And one day, like an old game of Go, we may wake up and find ourselves totally surrounded, if not directly by China, then by Chinese allies who are not going to let us have breathing room.
You know, it's such a good point that you just said. We have sacrificed so much in the Middle East, and really it's been a failure. Both the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan long term have not proved to have been well advised. And at the very least, amidst those military failures, what we could have done was divide our enemies in the Middle East, the Sunni and Shia divide, the divide between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria. And you're so right. It shows you the rapidity with which these relations can deteriorate. Trump was facilitating the Abraham Accords, bringing Israel closer to its Sunni Arab neighbors. And now under Biden, these adversaries are becoming closer together, aligned with Iran against Israel.
Yeah, and if you look at Trump, I know people had problems with him, but Trump was a savage, and that's what we needed. We needed a brute in the White House because the Chinese are brutal. They're sophisticated, they are civilized, they have a lot of power, but at the end of the day, that's a very brutal political system that the leaders of China are coming up in. And so they have a very, very brutal sense of the world. Worldview is not very friendly. And we need somebody in the White House, whether it's Trump or now DeSantis, but both of those guys, but Trump had a history of it, of basically showing that he could be brutal too. And they understood that, and they respected him in China and in Russia and even in Iran and North Korea. They respected that, and that's why they stayed their hand in a lot of cases. With Biden, on the other hand, he's America's Konstantin Chernenko. He is the man who's not there, and everybody knows it, which is why not only our enemies are taking advantage of it, but even our allies are taking advantage of us. It wouldn't be happening under Trump. So what we need is a leader who can speak that brutal language that the Chinese do and sort of meet force with force, and tell them over over a plate of chocolate cake that we just bombed Syria. That's what we need. We need more of that, not less.
Yes, what you're saying about China's worldview is important. I was saying to you, Brandon, before the show, why is it so hard for us to be friends or to respect each other? I said to you, I would want for China's success. I would want for Iran's success. Of course, not in their present situation where they are ruled by brutal authoritarians, but just in general, I have no problem with them succeeding economically and politically. China has a totally, as you just said, totally different worldview. And we as the United States, one of our issues, it seems to me, in our recent foreign policy track record, is we don't put ourselves in the situation, in the mindset of our adversaries. It doesn't mean that we condone that mindset. Right. We have to understand that mindset. So, when you just brought up Trump, it made me wonder, what was it about Trump and his policies that made him such a good American leader against China?
Well, I think it was the fact that he was unpredictable. He's a kinetic operator, and this is also his greatest weakness, though, also, is that he's not a planner. So he doesn't, it's just sort of, he's like America's id. He just sort of just goes with it. And what that does, though, is it makes it very difficult for centrally planned systems to react in a sort of reliable way that would benefit them. So they tend to be more conservative with a lowercase c. They tend to be more conservative in their grand strategies when someone like that is in the White House. Reagan was a little bit like that, although I would argue Reagan had the ability to not only be a kinetic player, but he married it to a really robust strategy. Reagan was a visionary in that way. He's one in a million. But Trump, his thing is he's a kinetic operator. And so I was talking with a mentor of mine in 2016. I was at the Institute of World Politics, and we had one of the leading Sovietologists from DIA there. And we were talking in his office, and he was sort of questioning my decision to support Trump. And we were chatting about foreign policy, and I said, "You don't really think he's a Russian spy?" And he laughed, and he said, "No." He goes, "No, I don't." He said, "In fact, everybody I know in Russia, the Russian elite are scared of him because they don't know what they're going to get with him. Because if you say the wrong thing to him, he might just blow up on you, or he might end up being your best friend. And that level of unpredictability is our best asset." So Trump was not the most well-versed in government affairs and managing a massive bureaucracy. We saw that. But the one thing he could do was put all of our rivals back on their feet. Look at North Korea. I don't think people realize, we were probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks away from a major war with North Korea. But what happened was Trump started flaming Kim Jong-un on social media. Kim Jong-un tried to fight back, but he quickly realized if Trump's button really is used, it is bigger than mine, and he can flatten me. And ultimately, all of these regimes, with the exception maybe of the mad mullahs of Iran, ultimately all of these regimes want to survive at the end of the day at all costs. And that is their greatest weakness. And unpredictability from the White House will keep them on their toes. Mad bomber theory, like Nixon.
That is extremely insightful. So can you remind me, frankly, I like to consider myself to be pretty clued in with foreign policy. And as you're saying this, we were 3 weeks away from war with North Korea. I'm smiling and nodding as if I know, but frankly, I don't really remember. And you know what? It's honestly a credit to President Trump, because I guess I didn't realize, as clued in as I like to think I am, how bad the situation was. What were the circumstances surrounding that strife?
Yeah, so 2017, it's the first half of the first year of the Trump administration. I'm forgetting the exact dates, but basically there was this just endless escalation from North Korea about over their nuclear weapons capability, specifically their perfecting of intercontinental ballistic missile capability, which is the real problem now we face from North Korea as well as Iran. They've already got nukes. That's not the issue. And in North Korea's case, they've managed to miniaturize those nukes back in 2013, which means they can marry them now to the top of any kind of ballistic missile they have. So the real issue for us was, how do we slow down and, if anything, prevent the North Koreans from perfecting their long-range ballistic missile capabilities so that they can't reach the United States anytime soon. North Korea was popping off those missiles as part of their tests, like they were, firecrackers on the 4th of July. And so Trump had to do something. And Trump started threatening North Korea, you need to stop, because diplomacy wasn't working. It had never worked. And once he started getting, threatening with Kim Jong-un started ratcheting up on his end, figuring, like all the other American leaders, that Trump would ultimately back down. Trump was not going to back down. We deployed for the first time in many years 3 different aircraft carriers at the same time in the Indo-Pacific as a signal to North Korea. Don't mess with us. We started upping our military readiness drills. We had a cavalcade of U.S. military leaders being trotted over to the Hill, in which they were publicly saying, we are preparing for war within weeks to a month. We will be prepared for warfare. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be awful, but we are prepared to go in and when the president gives the order. Those meetings were happening because Trump was very, very close to feeling like he had no choice but to initiate conflict. He did not want to. He knew that would be horrible, but that's his pressure campaign on North Korea ultimately broke that particular diplomatic dam. Kim Jong-un knew he was bluffing the whole time. Kim was bluffing, and that he had to fold, because if the Americans under Trump really did execute an invasion plan, a lot of Americans would die. It hurt our economy, might hurt Trump politically, but it's going to kill Kim Jong-un and his regime. So that's why he negotiated. And if Trump had gotten a second term, I believe probably we would have gotten a fully better lasting deal with Kim Jong-un that now is completely off the table, because we have, again, the man who's not there in the White House, Joe Biden.
I want to talk to you to close about Joe Biden and really the situation that we're facing if he's reelected in 2024. You and I agreed that this election is a turning point with regard to our relations with China. But I just want to quickly comment, because I think your point about Trump's volatility it's really important, and it's making me reflect, because it's something that we, with our Western democratic norms, criticize. But, even at times when we've seen him be volatile, or by our judgment appear to be irrational, you can tell he means business. Even when he's talking in those debates and he's saying, Hillary is a crook, and, lock her, like, he has this look about him which means business. I remember, even though I didn't remember the specifics, I do remember during that time of the North Korea strife, he was sitting in the conference room and he said to the reporters, they will be met like fire and fury, like we have never seen.
Right. And look at the body language in that clip. He's sitting slouched like this. They've got experts in all of these countries who all they do is watch the body language of our leaders. And that was not a man who was bluffing. Trump was very serious, and he would have flattened North Korea if necessary. Again, he didn't want to. I think he was sincere when he showed Kim Jong-un that video he had made of how real estate could save Pyongyang. I think that that Trump really wanted to do business with Kim. But if he had to, in 2017 in particular, the fire and fury speech, Trump was prepared to go full bore, and it would have hurt us, but it would have destroyed Kim, and it would have been a greater threat to it would be very damaging to the Chinese as well.
By the way, total tangent, and by total tangent, I mean total tangent. Is it safe for Americans, specifically Americans like us who speak out against, the Chinese regime, is it safe for us or in the North Korean regime to go to South Korea or Japan or even Hong Kong?
It's safe for us to travel there. I would just be careful if you are somebody who's critical of the Chinese regime, because they do have ways of getting to you. Um, I know a fairly large figure on the right who does China talks all the time, and he refused to go down to Mexico because that's a place the Chinese intelligence services can get to Americans they don't like pretty easily. And so traveling abroad, I mean, it's something to be done, and we need people to spread the good word. But people should be careful. I mean, it's very dangerous if you're a public figure, especially now with China really feeling their oats right now. They really think they've got our number because Biden is such a bad president. We exhibit nothing but weakness abroad.
So to close on this note of President Biden's weakness, what would it mean for the United States if President Biden wins re-election in 2024?
Well, it's the end of the American superpower experience. We are not a superpower at that point. At that point, it will be the permanent creation or the creation of a permanent vassal status for the United States in the new Chinese empire. And I'm not speaking hyperbolically there. Biden is in some way compromised by the Chinese. And furthermore, ideologically, Biden is like every other Democrat who fundamentally does not think that America deserves to be the most powerful nation in the world. So his policies and that of his party are reflective of that reality. And so we are looking at the diminishment and ultimately the end, just like with Konstantin Chernenko of the Soviet Union. We are looking at the diminishment and the end of America as the world superpower and handing it off to the People's Republic of China, which will make us a client state. And, it's at that point, we stop being America, not just because we lose our superpower, but because then we're going to let the Chinese fully into our system. And they're going to rig our system in such a way to ensure that no nationalist like myself or nobody on the right can actually get into power and actually have influence, because we're a threat to the Chinese agenda.
As if there weren't enough domestic issues to vote against Biden in 2024.
Well, they're all connected. They're all connected. Domestic and foreign, they're all connected.
You are absolutely right about that. I think about, just as a closing note, isn't it interesting, Brandon, how China, communist China, is more conservative than the United States culturally in many ways. They don't have any transgender individuals. They don't have any gay individuals, really, and a lot of it is awful. They're terrible to those who are not heterosexual. But meanwhile, so they practice something different in their own country, and then they are pushing the trans TikTok through their apps on American viewers.
Well, I'll tell you what a Chinese friend of mine said when I went to college. There was a gentleman, a fellow student. He used to tell me, Brandon, he said, we already went through our cultural revolution. We've already lived through that. He said, my parents lived through that, and we're not ever going to replicate that again here or there. But here, he said, it seems like your Americans want to do what we did in the 60s and 70s. So we used to talk about that a lot, and you're right. And now what they've done in China as part of their warfare through other means strategy, their unrestricted warfare strategy, is that they've basically weaponized the ideology of their fellow travelers in the American left, and they've used our technology that they've hijacked to basically pump in all of these noxious cultural revolutionary ideas in the American system, and they're piping it into the most vulnerable group, the young people, because they don't want the next generation of Americans to be competitive in the science, technology, engineering, math fields. They want all those Americans to be obsessed with being the next big TikTok or YouTube star, while the Chinese young people are the ones being the new innovators and the new creators and the new STEM people. And that's how they will achieve national greatness. That's how they will get to be the dominant superpower by the 100th year anniversary, 2049, of the founding of the People's Republic of China. It is a pernicious strategy, but it is highly effective. And what's more, it's working. And if Biden is reelected, God help us, they will probably achieve that goal.
I shudder to think about what China will be like by their centennial, and relatedly, as you say, it's all interconnected, what the United States will be like by China's centennial if we continue down this path. On that happy note, Brandon, thank you so much. There is hope. No, there is. In your book, I know you probably think I'm saying it because you're here. I love your book. It really, as a China research fanatic and just as an American who cares very much about this, it is so hugely informative. And so you give me a lot of hope by exposing Americans to these ideas. Brandon, thank you again for coming on to Timeless. You are a fixture of the show, so we will see you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
And as a reminder, you can check out the Weichert report, and Brandon is also a senior editor at 1945.com. I will see you all soon. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.